Much of what we take for granted today in Australia has been won through protests by ordinary citizens getting out there on the streets, in the forests, on the oceans, and protesting against development measures that would have destroyed some of Australia's iconic environmental treasures. Not just the environment. Protest movements have won votes for women, for instance, or gay liberation, for example. If we think about the ending of the Vietnam War or the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, these were citizens who protested for their rights. And what we're seeing now is the government in Tasmania attempting to impose severe restrictions on the right to protest. It will change the nature of democracy in Tasmania and indeed in Australia.
The Workplaces Protection from Protestors Bill is a particularly dangerous piece of legislation. It's dangerous not only to the Tasmanian community but to Tasmanian democracy.
The wording of the legislation is very vague, very imprecise. In fact, it's really sloppy. The whole legislation is very poorly put together. For example, it's very vague about what it means to incite somebody.
This bill criminalises peaceful protest where it interferes with a business. If you are a farmer who, with a few other farmers, gets together to protest and prevent fracking miners coming onto your property, you will break this law. If you are a pensioner who protests in the streets of Hobart against changes to your pension and you interfere with one business car going about its business, you'll break this law.
Under this legislation, citizens who walk into a forest or onto public land, if a policeman finds them and believes that they might be going to engage in some kind of protest, they can be arrested and the judge will have to fine them $5,000. If they do it a second time, they get thrown in jail compulsorily for 3 months. This is a profoundly anti-democratic measure by any understanding of the kind of democracy that we have had in Australia.
And what I fear is happening is that these rights that we've always presumed we had, which traditionally we thought we had, are being slowly eaten away. And unfortunately, this particular legislation is not eating it away, it's biting it away in big chunks.
This kind of measure reminds us of the extreme repressive regime of Joh Bjelke-Petersen in Queensland, which was recognised by human rights organisations around the world as an extremely oppressive one. But now what we're seeing is a shift towards the rights of developers over those of citizens in this Tasmanian legislation. It would lead to the kind of state where citizens' rights are increasingly restricted, where they have to conform to what the authorities say. And that's why I'm standing here in front of the Berlin Wall, perhaps the most potent symbol of the repressive state that persists in the world today.
One of the problems with putting this sort of legislation on the book is that maybe it won't be used by the current government, but what about further down the track? Once this legislation is there, the rights have gone and future governments, future people will continue to use it. And unfortunately, because the legislation is so sloppy, it may be used in all sorts of ways that would be absolutely horrifying to people today. So
that balance is essential. That protection of the environment must be uppermost in our minds, otherwise developers, whether they be forestry commissions or mining companies, they'll destroy it all if they can, and that's what this Liberal government wants. They want a free rein for developers to cut a swathe through the forests of Tasmania, to mine wherever they like, to walk onto any farm to engage in fracking.
It'd be very interesting to know how much money big business donated to the Liberal Party to have this kind of legislation brought in.
The legislation has already gone through the lower house. It's very important that people of Tasmania, and in fact I think people outside Tasmania, also need to express their concern about what's happening. This legislation must not be passed.
But let me say this, that this kind of legislation which limits the rights of citizens much more narrowly, is heading in this direction and in this direction only. And so this Tasmanian legislation must be defeated. It must be resisted. Citizens must protest against it so that they can live in a free Australia still.